Welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Our topic today is the slaves of the Founding Fathers. Who were the slaves of the Founding Fathers, and what do their individual stories tell us about the Founding Fathers as men? Well, let's start with George Washington. George Washington died on December the 14th, 1799. At the time of Washington's death, there were some 317 slaves living on his Mount Vernon estate. He owned 123 of these outright. He rented 40 from a neighbor, and 154 belonged to Martha Washington under the terms of her first husband's will. Under the terms of Washington's will, his slaves, not including the ones owned by Martha and his neighbor, were to be freed upon Martha Washington's death. Only one slave, William Lee, was freed outright in George Washington's will. Now, the terms of the will created an almost immediate problem for Martha Washington, because the only thing standing between 123 slaves and their freedom was her life. Now, according to contemporary letters, Martha Washington did not feel safe. She was afraid she was going to be poisoned. Nor was this fear entirely groundless, because the records of colonial Virginia document the trial of 180 slaves tried for poisoning their masters over the years. Well, Martha wasn't taking any chances. She freed Washington's slaves within a year after his death, but she never freed her own slaves. Now, Washington's relationship to slaves was that of a straightforward businessman. Washington insisted on turning a profit from his slaves. The pattern of life at Mount Vernon followed a pattern familiar throughout Virginia. The workday was from sunrise to sunset, with 2 hours off for meals. Sunday was a free day, and slaves received several days off at Christmas and the Mondays after Easter and Pentecost. Slaves received a weekly food allowance, which they supplemented by keeping their own gardens, fishing, and hunting. So you might say that they subsidized their own enslavement on their free time. Slaves were issued clothes once a year. Most of the slaves were field hands, while there were about 70 skilled craftsmen and household servants working at Mount Vernon. Runaways were not uncommon. 4 males escaped in 1761, but were recaptured. The slave Sam tried to run away several times, only to be caught. Another slave named Tom was a habitual runaway. He was shackled and sold off to a new master in the West Indies. It was the coming of the American Revolution and George Washington's subsequent rise to national prominence which allowed some of Washington's slaves to emerge from obscurity and enter into the full light of history. Let's talk about Henry Washington. This individual was born on the Gambia River around 1740. He was called Henry Washington. His real name is unknown. He was captured and sold into slavery sometime before 1763. He subsequently became the property of George Washington and was a groom in the stables at Mount Vernon. In November 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any slave who would help put down the American rebels. That December, George Washington, commanding the Continental Army in Massachusetts, received a report from his cousin Lund that Lord Dunmore's proclamation was inciting the passion of Washington's own slaves. Lund wrote, "There is not a man of them but who would leave us if they believed they could make their escape. Liberty is sweet." Well, in August of 1776, A month after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Henry Washington made his escape from Mount Vernon, making his way to the British lines and joining Lord Dunmore's all-black Ethiopian regiment. With several hundred men under arms, the Ethiopian regiment fought for the crown and the freedom of all blacks in slavery under the regimental motto, "Liberty to slaves." Lord Dunmore's forces were overwhelmed in Virginia, and the Ethiopian regiment disbanded. Henry Washington went on to serve in another Loyalist regiment, the Black Pioneers, under the command of Sir Henry Clinton, as they moved from New York to Philadelphia to Charleston, and after the fall of Charleston, back to New York. Henry Washington was not alone in joining the British. The so-called Black Loyalists in the Revolutionary War are estimated to have numbered between 80 and 100,000 runaways who sought freedom within the lines of the British Army. By freeing the slaves, the British forced slave masters to guard slaves, one of their chief economic assets, instead of fighting British troops. The British were willing to emancipate slaves if by so doing they could first cripple and then crush the rebellion. Much as in the later American Civil War, military necessity rather than morality acted as a catalyst of history. Now, the use of slaves by the British for military purposes soon prompted the American rebels to begin recruiting blacks themselves. George Washington gave his approval to Rhode Island's plan to raise an entire regiment of black slaves. The state bought and emancipated slaves willing to become soldiers. Similarly, Massachusetts raised an all-black unit, the Bucks of America under Samuel Middleton, the only black commissioned officer in the Continental Army. In October 1780, even Maryland accepted, quote, any able-bodied slave between 16 and 40 years of age who voluntarily enters into service with the consent and agreement of his master, unquote. New York began recruiting slaves in March 1781. By June 1781, some 1,500 of the 6,000 troops under George Washington's direct command were black. In 1782, a provisional treaty granting the American colonies their independence was signed by Great Britain. As the British prepared for their final evacuation, the Americans demanded the return of runaway slaves under the terms of the peace treaty. Well, the British refused to abandon black loyalists who had fought for the crown. Some 4,000 blacks who had served the crown during the war, together with their families, were listed in the so-called Book of Negroes. George Washington had insisted that such a list be made so that masters could be compensated for their lost property. Those lucky enough to make the list sailed to freedom in Canada and England. Among them was Henry Washington. Let's look at another individual, a fellow named William Lee. If Henry Washington can be regarded as a pro-British loyalist, then Billy Lee must be regarded as his polar opposite. George Washington bought Lee, his brother Frank, and 2 other slaves in 1768. Billy Lee was 18. Frank became the butler at Mount Vernon, while Billy became Washington's valet. Billy also became the keeper of Washington's pack of hunting dogs. Now, Washington took Billy Lee to war with him, where he served at Washington's side for 8 years. After the war, between 1785 and 1789, Lee injured both of his knees and found himself back at Mount Vernon. William Lee was freed under the terms of Washington's will for his faithful service during the Revolutionary War. and received a substantial pension for the remainder of his life and the option of remaining at Mount Vernon. Lee lived on at Mount Vernon until his death in 1828. George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States on April 30th, 1789. Now, initially, the president's residence was in New York City, but the capital moved to Philadelphia, and Washington brought 9 slaves from Mount Vernon to serve him at the president's house in Philadelphia. 2 of these slaves were to give him trouble. Uni Judge. Uni Judge actually belonged to Martha Washington under the terms of her first husband's will. More is known about Uni Judge than any other Mount Vernon slave because she lived to an old age and was interviewed by abolitionist newspapers in the 19th century. Uni grew up in service at Mount Vernon, eventually becoming Martha Washington's personal servant. Well, in April 1789, Uni was one of the 7 slaves taken to New York City to work in the presidential residence, and then she moved on to Philadelphia. Now, in Philadelphia, slavery was very unpopular, and being president in Philadelphia was a problem for Washington. A Pennsylvania law of 1780 prohibited the enslavement of residents of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The slaves brought from Mount Vernon were in danger of being emancipated under the Pennsylvania law. Attorney General Edmund Randolph advised the president on how to prevent this. There was a loophole in the 1780 law which allowed slave owners from other states to rotate their slaves out of Pennsylvania to avoid the residency requirements of the Pennsylvania law. If a slave spent even 1 day out of the Commonwealth during a 6-month period, he or she was not considered a resident of Pennsylvania and thus not subject to the law. New Jersey was only 1 mile away by boat from Philadelphia, and the president's slaves were routinely taken on day trips to New Jersey. In 1796, Martha Washington told Uni Judge that she intended to give her to a granddaughter, as Elizabeth Custis, as a wedding present. Well, Uni was having none of this and fled with the help of free black friends. She boarded a ship headed north and ended up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Martha Washington was shocked by Uni's flight. She felt betrayed and told all who would listen that, in her opinion, Uni must have been seduced and then abducted by a Frenchman. Martha urged George Washington to advertise a reward for Uni's capture. Well, Washington didn't do this. But eventually, Uni was recognized in Portsmouth by friends of the president. Washington took immediate action to regain his property, writing to the collector of customs in Portsmouth, asking him to seize her and put her on a vessel bound for Alexandria. The collector of customs cautioned the president, however, that such an action might create a riot in New Hampshire, which favored universal freedom. Washington backtracked and directed that nothing be done that might excite a mob or create any sensation to the citizens of New Hampshire. 2 years later, Washington's nephew was in New Hampshire on business, where, in addition to other things, he hoped to arrange for the return of Uni to Virginia. He failed. Under the laws of the land, Uni remained a fugitive for the rest of her life. She eventually married a sailor, had 3 children, and lived the remainder of her life in New Hampshire, dying on February the 25th, 1848. Hercules. Hercules was a slave at Mount Vernon who had been George Washington's longtime cook. He was summoned to Philadelphia to become now President Washington's personal cook. Hercules was a self-taught culinary genius, as highly accomplished as any cook anywhere in the country, according to those who sampled his cooking. Washington was very well pleased with Hercules and allowed him to make extra money by selling leftovers from the presidential kitchen. This extra money Hercules spent on expensive luxuries and fine clothing. A contemporary wrote, "His linen was of an exceptional quality, his waistcoat the same, his stockings the same, his shoes highly polished with large buckles covering a considerable part of the foot, a blue velvet collar and bright metal buttons, a long watch chain dangling from his fob, a cocked hat and a gold-headed cane completed the wardrobe of the celebrated dandy of the president's kitchen." In November 1796, during a visit of the president and his entourage to Mount Vernon, Hercules' son was caught stealing. Now, Washington suspected that the father and son were planning to run away. And with the example of Uni Judge fresh in his memory, he wasn't taking any chances. So Hercules was left behind at Mount Vernon, reduced to the status of a common laborer on the farm, digging clay for bricks. Well, Hercules had the last laugh, because on February the 22nd, 1797, George Washington's 65th birthday, Hercules made his bid for freedom, escaping from Mount Vernon forever. Now let's talk about Thomas Jefferson and the slaves of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson owned more than 600 slaves during his lifetime. Of these, 175 slaves came to him through inheritance, the rest through natural increase of slave families. While Jefferson bought few slaves, he sold over 100 in his lifetime, mainly for financial gain. He also transferred 85 slaves as gifts. Because Jefferson died deeply in debt, most of the other slaves were sold at auction and dispersed among different owners in Albemarle and surrounding Virginia counties after his death. Jefferson freed only 2 slaves in his lifetime and 5 in his will. And all of these freed were from one family, the Hemmings family. As early as 1802, rumors began to circulate that Thomas Jefferson had sired children by a beautiful young slave at his Monticello plantation named Sally Hemings. Jefferson's political opponents made much of the rumors at the time, but over the centuries, historians largely dismissed the story, which was preserved through an oral tradition handed down in the Hemings family. In 1998, however, the British science journal Nature published the results of a DNA study linking a member of the Jefferson family, not necessarily Thomas Jefferson, to the descendants of Sally Hemings. Subsequently, in January 2000, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, the custodians of Monticello, issued a report concluding that based on all available evidence, Thomas Jefferson was, in all probability, the father of at least one and perhaps all of the children of Sally Hemings. What was the nature of the love affair between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, which spanned some 37 years and gave birth to as many as 7 children? In 1772, Thomas Jefferson, 29, married the widow Martha Wales Skelton, 24. During their 10-year marriage, they had 6 children, only 2 of whom survived to adulthood. Martha Jefferson died following the birth of their 6th child. Before her death, she elicited a promise from her devoted husband that he would never remarry. After Martha's death, Jefferson was inconsolable and suffered from deep depression for years. In 1784, Thomas Jefferson became the American envoy to France. 3 years later, he sent for his 9-year-old daughter, Polly. Accompanying Polly was a maid, and that maid was Sally Hemings, estimated age between 14 and 16 at that time. During the course of the next 2 years in Paris, Jefferson formed an attachment to Sally that would span decades. Now, Jefferson need not have suffered from lack of female companionship in Paris, which was known as the most licentious capital in Europe. In fact, he formed a romantic attachment to Maria Causeway, the wife of a celebrated British painter, a relationship well documented in love letters saved by both parties. So who was this Sally Hemings who eclipsed the sophisticated beauties of Paris? Well, Sally Hemings was the daughter of Elizabeth Betty Hemings and, in all probability, John Wales, Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law. If so, Sally would have been the half-sister of Jefferson's dead wife, Martha. She would also have been a so-called quadroon, 3/4 white. Sally became part of Jefferson's property as an inheritance from the Wales estate in 1774. Sally was described by one former slave at Monticello as, quote unquote, mighty, near white, very handsome, long, straight hair down her back. Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Randolph, described her as light-colored and decidedly good-looking. These are the only two physical descriptions that we have. In 1789, Sally Hemings returned to the United States with Jefferson. Now, this was a matter of choice because in 1789, France was in the throes of revolution. Under French law, Sally could have petitioned for her freedom. She was becoming proficient in French and had a legal right to remain in France as a free person. Her son Madison later recounted that she was pregnant with Jefferson's child and willingly chose to return to Virginia with him, provided that he agreed to free any children that they might have. Jefferson agreed to this. And after returning, Jefferson's farm records show that Sally had 4 children who survived infancy. All of these children became free at or near the age of 21. Sally Hemings' children were light-skinned, and 3 of them, a daughter Harriet and 2 sons, Beverly and Eston, lived as members of the white community as adults. According to contemporary accounts, some of the children strongly resembled Thomas Jefferson. Sally Hemings remained at Monticello throughout the rest of her life, performing household duties, taking care of Jefferson's wardrobe, looking after the children, and doing light work such as sewing. Jefferson never freed Sally, probably because of a quirk in Virginia's slave laws that required a freed slave to leave the Commonwealth within 1 year. This love match required not only that Sally agree to remain a slave, but that Jefferson not free her. After his death in 1826, at the age of 83, Jefferson's daughter Martha Randolph gave Sally her time. This was a form of unofficial freedom that enabled her to remain in Virginia. Now, according to Madison Hemings, his mother lived in Charlottesville near Monticello with him and his brother Eston until her death in 1835 at the age of 62. Now, Jefferson had another slave whose name has come down through history, and this individual wasn't treated so well. His name was James Hubbard. In 1794, 11-year-old James Hubbard went to work in the nailery. He could make 7 pounds of nails each day, and Jefferson paid him a small amount for his efficiency. But as he grew up, he became problematic, and he began to run away quite a bit. He was caught, but 6 years later, he ran away again. Finally, after yet another escape, Jefferson had him brought back to Monticello, where he was severely flogged and committed to jail. Finally, he was sold off because Jefferson said that this man, in all circumstances, convinced me he will never again serve any man as a slave. So these are some of the stories of the slaves of the Founding Fathers. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.